Hello and welcome to Back to the Science. I'm Dr. Susan Oliver and I'm a scientist, and this is Cindy Oliver and she's a dog. I hope you all had a wonderful Christmas and New Year. My plans for the Christmas and New Year period were to take a break, ignore any anti-vax nonsense, catch up with family and friends, and read a few books. I managed to achieve most of that. Besides a few tweets, I did pretty much ignore all the anti-vax nonsense. I also caught up with family and friends, but I only managed to read one book. Why? Because I went down a rabbit hole and looked further into the case of Lucy Letby, who, for anyone who doesn't know, is a British nurse who was convicted of murdering or attempting to murder 15 babies. Anyway, one of the startling things that I found was that many of the arguments used by Letby supporters are exactly the same as the arguments used by anti-vaxxers. And in fact, many of the Letby supporters are anti-vaxxers, but certainly not all of them. Here's an example of a tweet by a Letby supporter. Lucy Letby is innocent, but there are vested interests with a lot to lose if she is set free. One such organisation is Madame Tussauds. With locations worldwide, new additions to the Chambers of Horrors would be a huge money spinner. The merch alone would be eye-watering, but if she is released, zilch. Madame Tussauds locations, and these are some of the locations that they included in the tweet. Move over, Big Pharma. Big Wax are leading the biggest conspiracies these days. Now, of course, not all Letby supporters are this crazy, but there are various versions of a conspiracy against Lucy Letby. A popular one is that a number of doctors that she worked with decided to use her as a scapegoat. Doctors involved in a conspiracy. Where have we heard that before? Then, of course, we have the experts who are expressing doubts about the verdict. You know, just like anti-vaxxers can find some experts who support their crazy views about vaccines. It doesn't matter that 99% of doctors and scientists disagree with these so-called experts and have pointed out why they are wrong. But anti-vaxxers are happy to believe contrarian doctors and dismiss all others. And Letby supporters are exactly the same. But wait, there's more. Letby supporters are being silenced, just like anti-vaxxer doctors and scientists claim. So this article is about a paper written by a statistician called Honorary Professor John Quigley, which has been rejected by a journal. Happens to papers all the time. He claims the journal rejected the paper because they didn't want to upset the families of Lucy Letby's victims. I think this is highly unlikely to be the only reason, because the same journal published another paper by the same author about Lucy Letby earlier this year. A more likely reason the paper was rejected is because it's total bollocks. So this is the paper here. Logical and statistical errors in the investigation and prosecution of suspected serial killer nurses, which is a rather weird title because one of the cases covered is Sally Clark, who was neither a nurse nor a serial killer. The paper does cover 2 European cases, however, where convictions against nurses convicted of being serial killers were later overturned. But we're just going to look at the Lucy Letby section. So this is how it starts. The neonatal unit where she worked at the Countess of Chester Hospital UK had been the subject of some blistering criticism, the most telling being a full report of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health in 2016, detailing a catalogue of serious shortcomings at the hospital, noting that nursing and staffing levels were inadequate. Okay, so I have read this report, and blistering criticism is a wild exaggeration. It certainly contains criticism, but it points out the following. The review team agreed that there were no obvious factors which linked the deaths and that circumstances in the unit were not materially different from those which might be found in many other neonatal units within the UK. And looking specifically at staffing, they note that compliance is 21% below target at the Countess of Chester, but it's 27% below target across the network. In other words, the Countess of Chester neonatal unit is actually performing better than other neonatal units when it comes to staffing. The paper goes on. The RCPCH also notes that the increased mortality of 2015 went beyond the neonatal unit, since stillbirths on the maternity ward showed a similar increase. This is what the RCPCH report actually said about stillbirths. The obstetricians were pleased to report to the review that there had been no stillbirths since 15th of October 2015. The paper goes on. The catalogue of risk factors described in a report in the Telegraph newspaper in September 2024, as well as a thorough article in the New Yorker magazine in May, continued to pile up. And you notice that the New Yorker magazine has been included as a reference. I find it a little bizarre that Professor O'Quigley has included the New Yorker magazine as a reference, but he hasn't included the actual RCPCH report. It suggests that he never looked at the RCPCH report and just accepted that what was written about it in the New Yorker magazine was correct. Now, it just so happens that I first became interested in the Lucy Letby case when I read the New Yorker article, and I did initially think that she could be innocent. So what I did was I looked further into the claims being made in the article, and I found they were extremely misleading. Like, for instance, talking about staffing problems, but not mentioning that they were actually worse in other neonatal units that hadn't had a spike in deaths. Anyway, back to the paper again. We're still on the first paragraph of the Lucy Letby section, but don't worry, we're not going to actually read every single line in the paper. Anyway, it then says, these included the fact that despite poor conditions, the unit had been upgraded to accept the much higher risk, lower gestational ages and lower birth weights, added to which outdated facilities allowing occurrences of raw sewage to find its way onto the unit, all combined to create an environment in which the risk to the more fragile of the neonates was unacceptably high. This is just more misinformation. The unit wasn't upgraded to accept more high-risk babies. It always accepted them, and there was no real difference in the gestational ages of the babies in the unit during Letby's killing spree. And there was one case of raw sewage backing up into a sink in the unit, but it didn't correspond with any of the collapses or deaths. And none of the babies included in the indictment died of an infection anyway. Enter the villain. For anti-vaxxers, it's usually Dr. Anthony Fauci, an extremely talented doctor and scientist who became the public face of the fight against COVID in the US. And because of this, he also became the subject of a disgusting smear campaign by anti-vaxxers who resorted to attacking him because they had no valid criticism of the vaccines. For Letby supporters, the villain is Dr. Dowie Evans. Here's how Professor O'Quigley introduces him. Enter into the story an uncommonly colourful, enigmatic and larger-than-life character, Dr. Dowie Evans, a quirky yet gifted colleague of the two consultants and a man who went on to play multiple roles. Not really the type of language you'd expect to see in a scientific paper. And by the way, Dr. Evans had never met any of the consultants from the hospital prior to his involvement in the case, despite the suggestion in this sentence that he had. Although a lot of criticism of the Letby case focuses on Dr. Evans, he wasn't the only expert who presented evidence at the trial. There were another 7 experts who gave evidence, and of course, the doctors and nurses who worked with Letby also gave evidence against her, as did the parents of the babies she harmed. Moving on, Professor O'Quigley also claims he has shown that there wasn't really an unexplained spike in deaths on the neonatal unit at all. And it's not just him either. Other authors such as Peter Elston, Scott McLaughlin, and Norman Fenton have confirmed it. Remember earlier I mentioned that a lot of Letby supporters are anti-vaxxers? Well, both Scott McLaughlin and Norman Fenton just happen to be anti-vaxxers. I don't think Peter Elston is an anti-vaxxer, but he did used to host a podcast about Lucy Letby with a guy who is an anti-vaxxer. Anyway, that's by the by. Let's have a look at Professor O'Quigley's proof that the spike is explicable. Well, it certainly looks like it based on this figure. I mean, hey, look at all those other hospitals that also have high death rates. Only problem is this chart is completely irrelevant. The chart is showing neonatal death rates based on the place of birth. The spike in deaths at the Countess of Chester Hospital was in babies admitted to the neonatal unit, not in babies that were born. Most babies born are not admitted to the neonatal unit, and not all babies in the Countess of Chester neonatal unit were even born at the Countess of Chester. Okay, so the data for this chart comes from the annual MBRACE UK reports. The data for 2014 comes from Table 9, shown here, and the data for 2015 comes from Table 11 here. You will also notice that the tables contain both crude and stabilised and adjusted rates. The report explains this is because you can't use crude rates to compare hospitals, and yet Professor O'Quigley has used crude rates to do just that. And again, this is something that anti-vaxxers do all the time. They show graphs that look really convincing, but when you look further into the data, it's clear that it's not showing what they claim. The correct way to compare the death rate in the Countess of Chester neonatal unit with other neonatal units is to do just that. And that's what they've done in this table here. They've compared deaths from January 2015 to July 2016 between the Countess of Chester and other level 2 neonatal units, also known as LNUs, in the same network. And as you can see, there were 13 deaths at the Countess of Chester and a maximum of 2 anywhere else. So, contrary to the claims in the paper, there was definitely a spike in mortality, and it wasn't seen in other LNUs at the same time. We also know nursing staff in Chester NNU was above the national average. The percentage of shift staff to BAPM standards was higher than other LNUs in the network and higher than the national average. Chester was providing a similar amount of high dependency and intensive care days as other LNUs in the network. And high dependency and intensive care days did not change appreciably in 2015 and 2016 compared to previous years. So the spike isn't explicable after all. It remains inexplicable. But Professor O'Quigley isn't finished. He, of course, has a section of the paper on the infamous shift chart. A number of statisticians are up in arms about this chart because they think it might be an example of the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. This is a chart here. It shows which nurses were on shift for the 25 events that were included in the indictment for Lucy Letby. And it just so happens that Letby was on shift for all 25 events. whereas the most any other nurse was on shift was 7 times. And there is also a separate chart for doctors that shows similar. Now, what people are claiming is that they basically just cherry picked the collapses and deaths when Letby was present and ignored the ones where she wasn't there. But if you included all of them, Letby would be no different than anyone else. And I have to say, when I first heard this argument, I found it pretty convincing. But as I always do, I decided to look into it further. And it turns out it's bollocks. And there are 2 reasons for this. First reason is we know exactly how the chart was created because Dr. Dowie Evans has done interviews with every man and his dog about it. And we know they didn't just cherry pick the events where Letby was present. Here's how Dr. Evans explained it in one interview. He said he got involved in the case in May 2017 and told Cheshire Police not to tell him if they suspected anyone of being responsible for criminality. In other words, I wanted to investigate the cause of the deaths of these babies. I was not there to investigate the crime. At that time, I was unaware of the name Lucy Letby or anyone else. I received a copy of the clinical notes of over 30 babies who had either died or collapsed between January 2015 and July 2016. And I looked at all of them. Some of these cases, you could understand why the baby had died. They died of problems with small babies, hemorrhage, infection, a congenital problem, for instance. But I identified 15 babies whose collapse I could not explain as a natural cause. In addition to that, their collapse was not only unexpected, but I felt was due to a condition we call air embolism. It was as if someone had injected air into their circulation directly. Other babies collapsed, in my opinion, as a result of someone injecting loads and loads of milk or milk and air directly into the stomach. If you inject loads and loads of milk into the stomach of a small baby, it will interfere with their breathing because the diaphragm can't go up and down and therefore they collapse. Other babies suffered direct trauma. They were found with blood around their mouths or blood at the back of their throat. So all of these baby collapses could not be explained at all other than someone had caused harm to them. And then later in 2018, I found 2 more cases. These were the second of 2 separate lots of twins who had low blood glucose levels. Low blood glucose or low blood sugar is common in small babies, but a very astute medical officer in Chester had measured these babies' insulin level, and the insulin level was very, very high, which could not be explained on the basis of their producing their own insulin. So out of 32 cases, he found 15 suspicious cases, and then there were an extra 2 insulin cases that were added later. Some of the 15 suspicious cases included more than one suspicious event, which is how they got to 25 events on the shift chart. Importantly, though, Dr. Evans wasn't told in advance who they were suspicious of. He just identified the cases, and when they checked, she was present for all of them. The other reason that we know that they didn't just cherry pick the 25 events that she was on shift for is because she was actually present for more than 25 events. This is the original report that was compiled for the police by the consultants at the hospital at the start of the investigation. And they identify another 13 cases where Letby was present for a death or collapse, in addition to the ones where she was charged. So therefore, Letby was present for at least 38 events and not just 25. And we also know from other information that's been released that she was on shift for 15 out of 17 deaths that occurred during the 13 months, despite only working 20% of the available shifts. But Professor Quigley doesn't know about any of this. So in his paper, he sets out to prove statistically that the data in the chart was cherry-picked. And in the process, he inadvertently provides more evidence that Letby is guilty. He starts off by saying the 25 events were a subset of 61 total events. But he provides no reference for this statement and doesn't explain how he came up with the number 61. Seems higher than what it should be based on other things, but we don't know where he got the number from. He then does some very fancy statistics using a technique called missing completely at random, or MCAR, to determine how many shifts where an event occurred you would expect a nurse to be present if she wasn't actually responsible for the event. And based on this analysis, he estimates the probability of being present for 25 or more is less than 0.006. He then goes even further and states, out of the 61 cases, including 25 suspicious cases, Nurse Letby was there for all 25. Could she have been present for more than 25, suspicious or not? Not really, based on our worst case assumption of an odds ratio of 10 and the information we see in the figure, so our best bet has to be 25. But we know she was present for more than 25 events. She was present for at least 38 and possibly more. But Professor Quigley has just proven that this couldn't happen. Even if you use a worst case assumption of her being present 10 times more often when an event occurs. What this means is his worst case assumption wasn't the worst case assumption at all. The odds of her being present when a death or collapse occurred must actually be much higher than 10 to 1. So Professor Quigley has actually provided more compelling evidence that supports her guilt. So perhaps the reason that his paper was rejected was because the reviewers recognised that it was bollocks and he is not being silenced at all. Of course, the fact that Letby was on shift when a baby collapsed or died more than 10 times more often than any other nurse isn't actually evidence of her guilt. There could be another reason for the strong association, but there was also a mountain of evidence presented during the 10-month trial, and a lot of it is very compelling. If you are interested in learning more, there is a YouTube channel called Crime Scene to Courtroom, and the channel's owner has purchased trial transcripts, and he reads them out during his videos so you can assess the evidence yourself. So, in summary, although a lot of the Lucy Letby is innocent stories sound compelling if you take them at face value, if you look into them further, you see that they are just using the same tactics that anti-vaxxers have deployed for decades. If you'd like to look further into the data I presented, I provided links in the video's description. And please remember, this video is about the science, but you shouldn't take it as medical advice. For that, you should speak to your medical practitioner. If you've got this far, thank you for listening. And if you've liked, shared, or commented on the video, double thank you, because that helps the algorithm and means that more people will see the video. And of course, thank you to everyone who has bought me a coffee or little Cindy here a treat. We really appreciate your support. We will be continuing to make videos about the science in the future. So if you'd like to join the cool kids and stay informed, please hit the subscribe button. Thank you.